What is the price of a man's soul? In the unforgiving heart of 1880s, Texas, some said it was a handful of silver, others a bottle of cheap whiskey. But for Elara Thompson, a woman carrying a future in her womb and a widow's secret in her heart, the price was a desperate gamble made in the dust and degradation of a debtor's auction. She saw a broken man, a crippled cowboy named Silas Blackwood, and his two silent, haunted twin boys. In their eyes, she saw not a lost cause, but a flicker of a life she could save. She bought them their debt, their very freedom. She thought she was buying ranch hands. She had no idea she was buying a key to her own past and a stake in a war for redemption she was destined to fight. The sun was a merciless hammer over Redemption Gulch, beating the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder that clung to everything. It coated the rough-hewn facade of the saloon, settled on the wilting bonnets of the few respectable women out for provisions, and filmed the inside of Elara Thompson's throat. She stood in the thin sliver of shade offered by the assayer's office, one hand resting protectively on the pronounced swell of her belly, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past 7 months. This town and this heat were a world away from the manicured lawns and cool drawing rooms of San Antonio, where she'd lived with her late husband, Richard. Richard, with his soft hands and his talk of investments and futures, had purchased the sprawling Blackwood Creek Ranch for her, calling it an anchor in the new world. He had died of a sudden fever just 2 months after signing the deed, leaving Elara a widow pregnant and the sole owner of 1,000 acres of wild Texas land she had never seen. Coming here was not a choice. It was a necessity. The money from his estate was tied up in legal wrangling by his distant, vulture-like family. The ranch was all she truly had, and the ranch needed hands, experienced ones. But experienced hands cost money she didn't have, and they answered to men, not to a lone, pregnant woman they sized up with a mixture of pity and contempt. That was what had brought her to this sordid spectacle in the center of town. A debtor's auction. It was a cruel frontier practice, a step above indentured servitude. Men who couldn't pay their debts to the saloon, the bank, or the town's de facto ruler, Jebediah Kane, were put on a block. Their debt was sold to the highest bidder, and they were bound to work it off their labor owned as surely as a horse or a plow. It was a market of human misery, and Jebediah Kane was the chief merchant. Kane stood on the auction platform now, a barrel-chested man, with a florid face and a silver buckle belt that strained against his girth. His voice boomed across the dusty clearing. Next up, a special lot. A man and his baggage. Silas Blackwood. A ripple of cruel laughter and jeering murmurs went through the crowd of dusty ranch hands and bored townsfolk. 2 of Kane's men shoved a man forward. He stumbled his right leg, dragging at an unnatural angle, the boot on that foot worn away on the side from the perpetual scrape against the ground. He was tall, but gaunt, his face a mask of hardened planes and sharp angles, shadowed by a dirty, sweat-stained hat. But it was his eyes that caught Elara. Under the brim of that hat, they burned with a cold blue fire, a defiance that seemed utterly out of place in a man so thoroughly broken. "As you all know," Kane sneered, enjoying his performance. "Mr. Blackwood here had a bit of a run-in with a bull, and a string of bad luck with his finances. He owes me a considerable sum. $200. A gasp rippled through the crowd. $200 was a fortune, the price of a prime bull not a crippled ranch hand. But Cain continued, holding up a hand. The price includes his encumbrances. He gestured behind Silas. Two small boys, no older than 5 or 6, stood clutching the back of their father's torn trousers. They were identical, with the same shock of unruly dark hair and the same unnervingly serious faces. They didn't cry or shrink away. They just watched the crowd with their father's same intense, silent gaze, their small hands balled into fists. "Twins," Cain said with a dismissive wave. "Another 2 mouths to feed. But the boy here won't work without 'em. So you get the whole set. What am I bid for the debt of Silas Blackwood and his whelps?" Silence. A hot, thick silence, broken only by the buzzing of flies. The men in the crowd looked away. A crippled hand was a liability. A crippled hand with 2 children was a millstone. They would eat more than he could ever earn. $50. Cain prodded his jovial mask, slipping to reveal a flash of irritation. "Come now, he's got 2 good hands. He can mend fences, muck a stall." "He can't ride Cain," someone shouted from the back. "What good is a cowboy who can't sit a horse?" "He can teach," Cain countered, desperation creeping into his voice. He had clearly expected to make an example of Silas, and the town's refusal to play along was an insult. $20. 10. Someone give me $10, just to be rid of the sight of him. Silas Blackwood stood motionless, his face unreadable, his jaw a hard line of granite. He didn't plead or beg. He just stared out at the horizon over the heads of the crowd, as if their jeers and their pity were nothing more than the buzzing of insects. He was looking at the distant, hazy outline of the hills, the very hills where Ilara's new ranch sat. It was in that moment that Ilara felt a surge of something hot and unfamiliar in her chest. It wasn't pity. It was indignation, the sheer brutal injustice of it. To sell a man a father like he was nothing more than damaged goods. She saw the 2 boys, their knuckles white where they gripped their father's legs, and she saw her own unborn child. What kind of world was she bringing her baby into? A world run by men like Jebediah Cain. Before she could analyze the impulse, before her rational mind could scream. At the folly of it, her voice clear and steady cut through the oppressive heat. $20. Every head in the clearing swiveled to face her. The whispers started instantly, a wave of shock and disbelief. The pregnant widow, the outsider. What in God's name was she doing? Jebediah Cain's eyes widened, then narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He looked from her to Silas, a slow, malevolent smile spreading across his face. "Well, well. Mrs. Thompson, a surprise bidder. Did I hear you say 20? You did so," Ilara confirmed, lifting her chin. Her heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Going once?" Cain bellowed his gaze, sweeping the crowd, challenging anyone to interfere. "Going twice." He paused, letting the drama hang in the air. Silas finally lowered his gaze from the horizon and looked at her. For the first time, their eyes met across the dusty expanse. She saw shock, confusion, and a deep, profound suspicion. He didn't look grateful. He looked like a cornered wolf who couldn't fathom why the trap had suddenly sprung open. "Sold." Cain slammed a fleshy hand down on the railing. "To the charitable Mrs. Ilara Thompson, for the sum of $20. Collect your property, ma'am." The word property landed like a slap. The crowd began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. Ilara's face burned with a mixture of shame and defiance. She walked forward, her purse clutched in her hand, and approached the platform. She avoided looking at Silas instead, handing the coins to Cain, her fingers recoiling from the brief touch of his damp, hot palm. "The debt is paid," she said, her voice low but firm. "The contract is with me. It is to be worked off at the Blackwood Creek Ranch." She finally forced herself to look at the man she had just bought. Up close, he was even more worn than he appeared from a distance. A long, thin scar cut across his left cheekbone. His hands were calloused and scarred, but his fingernails were clean. He smelled of dust sweat and a faint, lingering scent of horse. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice softening so slightly. "My wagon is over by the livery." He didn't move. He just stared at her, his blue eyes searching her face for the trick. The angle, the hidden cruelty he was sure must be there. One of the twins, the one on the right, peeked out from behind his leg. "Pa," the boy whispered. That single word seemed to break the spell. Silas gave a slow, stiff nod. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything at all. He just turned, gently nudged his sons forward, and began the slow, painful process of limping toward her wagon. His brokenness on display for the entire town of Redemption Gulch to see. Elara watched them go, the tall, shattered man, and his two small, silent shadows. A cold knot of fear and uncertainty tightened in her stomach. What had she done? She hadn't just hired a ranch hand. She had bought a man's life and his children's for the price of a few bags of flour. And as she followed them to the wagon, she couldn't shake the feeling that the auction wasn't truly over. It had just moved to a new, more private stage, and the final price was yet to be determined. The journey to the Blackwood Creek Ranch was steeped in a silence as thick and heavy as the dust their wagon wheels churned up. Silas sat on the buckboard beside her, a rigid statue of resentment, his gaze fixed on the rumps of the two sturdy draft horses. The twins Leo and Finn were tucked into the back amidst the sacks of flour and beans, their small faces betraying nothing. Elara had tried to speak once, a comment about the heat, but the single guttural grunt she received from Silas in reply was a clear message words were not welcome. So she drove her mind a whirlwind. The stares of the townspeople had felt like physical blows. They saw a foolish woman an easy mark. Perhaps they were right. She had acted on an impulse, a flash of righteous anger that had now cooled into the cold, hard reality of her decision. She had a crippled, hostile man and his two children. Her ranch, which her lawyer's letters had described as rustic, was likely a ruin. Her baby was due in less than 2 months. She was in far over her head. When they finally crested the last rise, the ranch came into view, in the valley below, nestled along a winding cottonwood-lined creek. From a distance it was picturesque. Up close it was a testament to neglect. The main house, a solid 2-story log structure, was weathered and grey with a sagging porch and several missing shingles. The barn door hung askew on one hinge, and the fences that bordered the pastures were a tangle of broken rails and sagging wire. Richard's anchor looked as though it was one good storm away from sinking. As she pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, Silas finally stirred. He slid off the buckboard with a pained grunt, landing heavily on his good leg. He surveyed the scene, his expression grim but unsurprising, as if this was exactly the state of ruin he expected. "The well is 50 yards east of the house," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken to her. "It's deep. Shouldn't be dry." Elara stared at him. "How would you know that—" A flicker of something anger, pain, regret crossed his face before being extinguished. "Just a guess," he muttered, turning away to help his sons from the back of the wagon. The first few days were a strained dance of avoidance. Elara took the main bedroom upstairs, while Silas and the boys claimed a small, dusty room off the kitchen that had likely been for a live-in cook. She cooked meals, leaving their plates on the rough-hewn kitchen table, and they would eat only after she had retired to the porch or her room. The silence was their constant companion, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the low murmur of Silas's voice as he spoke to his sons at night, too low for Elara to make out the words. He couldn't do the heavy work the ranch desperately needed. He couldn't lift heavy timbers to fix the barn or ride the fence line. But he wasn't idle. On the second day, Elara found him by the corral, his bad leg propped up on the bottom rail. He was meticulously braiding a new rope from strands of old frayed lariats, his scarred hands moving with a fluid, practiced grace. The next day he sat on the porch, sharpening every dull axe and tool she owned, with a whetstone, the rhythmic shing, 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 a steady, almost comforting sound. He was a man of immense knowledge, trapped inside a broken body. He'd watch her struggle to hitch the draft horses, his jaw tight with impatience, before finally saying, "You're pulling the strap too tight on the bay. He'll bloat on you." He'd see her examining a patch of sorry-looking ground near the house and mutter, "Too much alkali in that soil. Nothing but weeds will grow there." His advice was always curt, offered grudgingly, as if the words were being physically dragged from his throat. The boys were his shadows, silent and watchful. They did their chores without complaint, hauling water and feeding the chickens Elara had purchased. They never played. They never laughed. They moved with a solemnity that was deeply unsettling in children so young. Elara tried to engage them, offering them peppermint sticks she'd bought in town, but they only looked to their father, accepting the candy only after he gave a curt nod. They were a closed unit, a tiny fortress of 3 against the world, and she was on the outside. The breakthrough, when it came, was small and unexpected. A week after their arrival, a cool evening, descended a blessed reprieve from the oppressive heat. Elara was sitting on the porch swing, a book of poetry by Miss Dickinson, a relic of her old life resting unread in her lap. The twins were sitting on the steps, whittling small figures from scraps of wood with a knife their father had given them. She began to hum a soft, simple lullaby her own mother used to sing. She wasn't thinking, just letting the familiar melody fill the twilight air. After a moment, she noticed the whittling had stopped. Both boys were watching her, their heads cocked. The boy on the left, who she was beginning to realize was the quieter of the two. Finn had a look of intense concentration on his face. Feeling bold, she switched from humming to singing the words softly. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." When she finished the verse, a tiny voice piped up from the steps. Our mama sang that. It was Leo, the more outspoken twin. His voice was rusty, as if from disuse. Elara's heart gave a painful lurch. She did. She had a beautiful voice, I'm sure. Finn nodded a solemn, jerky motion. She's an angel now, he whispered, echoing a phrase he had clearly been taught to say. Silas emerged from the shadows of the barn, his limp more pronounced in his exhaustion. He froze, hearing the tail end of the conversation. His face hardened, and for a moment Elara thought he would be angry that she had trespassed on sacred ground. "Boys," he said, his voice rough. "Inside. Time for bed." They obeyed instantly, scrambling up and disappearing into the house without a backward glance. Silas remained his silhouette, stark against the deepening purple of the sky. "You shouldn't have," he said, his voice low. "I was just humming." Elara defended herself. her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean any harm." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "They don't need to be reminded of what they've lost. And they don't need to live in a world without a single soft word or a song either." She retorted, her earlier indignation flaring back to life. "They are children, Mr. Blackwood, not soldiers." He flinched as if she had struck him. He looked from her face to the dark doorway his sons had disappeared through. The anger in his expression warred with a deep, bottomless sorrow. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. Without another word, he turned and limped into the house, the scrape of his boot on the wooden porch echoing in the quiet night. Elara stayed on the swing, her body trembling. She had breached the wall just for a moment. She had seen the man behind the mask of bitterness, the father struggling to shield his sons from a world that had already dealt them a devastating blow. The next morning, as she was heading out to the chicken coop, she found a small, crudely whittled bird sitting on the porch rail. It was unmistakable. A mockingbird. She picked it up, its rough edges soft against her palm. It was a peace offering, an apology, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, this broken alliance could be mended. And for the first time since she'd left San Antonio, Elara felt a fragile, tentative flicker of hope for the future she was trying to build in this wild, unforgiving land. With the carving of the mockingbird, a subtle shift occurred. The silence that had defined their existence on the ranch didn't disappear, but it became less of a weapon and more of a shared space. Silas began to speak more freely, though his sentences remained clipped and practical. He instructed her on the subtle signs of a coming storm, the best way to patch the leaky roof, and which of the wild herbs growing by the creek were good for tea. He was, Elara realized, with a growing sense of awe, a master of this land. He knew its rhythms, its secrets, its moods, as if it were a living part of him. The boys, Leo and Finn, began to thaw as well. They would bring her things they found on their explorations: a hawk's feather, a strangely shaped stone, a handful of wild plums. They started to ask her questions, their curiosity slowly winning out over their ingrained caution. Leo, the bold one, wanted to know about the city, about buildings so tall they touched the clouds. Finn, the quiet observer, would sit near her as she sewed clothes for the coming baby, watching her needle flash in and out of the fabric, his dark eyes wide with a gentle wonder. One afternoon, Silas was working on the broken barn door, showing a surprising aptitude for carpentry, despite his leg. Elara brought him a cup of water. He was studying the intricate network of abandoned swallow nests under the eaves. "My wife, she loved the swallows," he said, his voice distant. "Said they were a promise, that no matter how far they flew, they always came home." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife directly to her. Elara's heart ached for him for the profound loss that was etched into every line on his face. "What was her name?" she asked softly. "Mary." He said the name as if it were a prayer. "She was everything this land is not. Soft, gentle, full of light." He looked at Elara, at her swollen belly. She died giving birth to them. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful. It explained everything: his fierce overprotectiveness, the boy's solemnity, the fortress of grief he had built around his family. "I'm so sorry, Silas," Elara whispered. He just nodded, taking the cup of water from her, his gaze turning back to the swallow nests. "Some things," he said more to himself than to her, "can't be fixed." A week later, necessity drove Elara back to Redemption Gulch for supplies. She left with a sense of dread, hating the feeling of the town's judging eyes on her. As she was waiting for the clerk at the mercantile to weigh out a bag of coffee beans, she overheard two old ranchers talking by the cracker barrel. "Can't believe Jebediah Kane lets her stay out there," one of them, a man named Hank, grumbled. "On the old Blackwood place. Seems like bad luck." "Serves Blackwood right if you ask me," the other one spat. Got too big for his britches, thinking he could compete with Kane on the Longhorn market. Pride goeth before a fall, and his fall was a long one. Elara froze her hand, hovering over a bolt of calico. The old Blackwood place. "Still," said Hank, "it was his family's land. His father worked that creek for 30 years before him. To lose it all like that, and for Kane to get it for a song. It ain't right." Elara's blood ran cold. She paid for her goods in a daze, her mind reeling. Blackwood Creek Ranch. Silas Blackwood. It couldn't be a coincidence. The way he knew the location of the well, his intimate knowledge of the soil, the way he looked at the distant hills that first day at the auction. It hadn't been a stranger's gaze. It had been the look of a king surveying his stolen kingdom. The ride home was a torment of confusion and a rising sense of betrayal. He had been living on her charity, on the very land that had once been his, and he had never said a word. The fragile trust she had built with him felt like a house of cards in a hurricane. She found him by the corral, working with a young half-wild colt she'd acquired as part of the ranch purchase. The horse was skittish and mean, but Silas approached it with an almost supernatural calm. He wasn't breaking it. He was communing with it. His low voice, a steady murmur, his movements slow and deliberate. The colt, which had tried to kick her twice, stood as still as a statue, its ears twitching, its eyes fixed on him. In that moment, he was not a crippled cowboy. He was whole. He was magnificent. The sight only hardened her resolve. She waited until he had finished, until he had given the colt a final, gentle pat on the neck, and turned to leave. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the calm evening air. Silas stopped his back to her. "Is what true, ma'am? This ranch, this land. It was yours, wasn't it? Blackwood Creek Ranch. It was named for your family." He stood perfectly still for a long moment. Then he slowly turned to face her. The weariness in his face was immense, the look of a man who had run as far as he could, only to find himself back at the start. "Yes," he said simply. There was no defiance in his voice now, only a fathomless exhaustion. "It was." "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice rising with a mix of hurt and anger. "Why did you let me bring you here, let me offer you my pity, my charity, on the very ground that was stolen from you?" "Pride, I suppose," he said, his gaze dropping to the dust. "And shame. What was I to say thank you for buying me at auction, ma'am? And by the way, you're sleeping in my father's bed." He looked up, and the fire was back in his eyes. "And how do you know it was stolen? The whole town saw me sign the deed of sale over to Kane. They saw me take his money for the cattle. The men in town said you were cheated." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "Cheated is a polite word for it. Jebediah Kane wanted this valley. He wanted my water rights. He wanted my herd of prime longhorns, the one I'd spent years building. He couldn't buy it, so he decided to take it." He limped over to the fence, leaning against it, the story pouring out of him, as if a dam had finally broken. He had a partner, a sophisticated man from back east, a man with a head for numbers and contracts who knew how to twist words until they meant the opposite of what you thought. They offered me a partnership, a way to get my cattle to the lucrative markets in Kansas City. It sounded too good to be true, and it was. He recounted the tale with a dead, emotionless voice. The falsified cattle counts the contracts with hidden clauses. The mountain of debt that appeared out of nowhere. When he finally realized the depth of the swindle, he confronted Cain. The bull accident that crippled him had happened a week later in a remote canyon, with only Cain's men as witnesses. Broke, crippled, and with 2 sons to feed, he'd had no choice but to sign away his land to cover the fraudulent debt. Elara listened, her anger melting away, replaced by a profound and horrified sympathy. This was worse than she could have imagined. This was a story of pure evil, of calculated destruction. "This partner," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This man from the city. Did he have a name?" Silas stared at the main house at the porch, where she sat each evening at the windows of the room where she slept. His face was a mask of cold, hard grief. He was a smooth talker. Silas said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it. Came out here with his fancy suits and his promises of wealth. Said his name was Richard. Richard Thompson. The world tilted. The air rushed from Elara's lungs, and she grabbed the fence rail to keep from falling. It couldn't be. It was a nightmare. The name, the description, the timeline, it all fit. The money Richard had used to buy this very ranch, the money that was supposed to be her anchor, her salvation. It was the same money that had been used to destroy this man. Her inheritance, her future, the very ground beneath her feet was fertilized with the ruin of Silas Blackwood. She looked at Silas, at his haunted blue eyes. She looked at the house, which was no longer a sanctuary, but a monument to a terrible crime. And she looked down at the child growing within her, a child of the Thompson name. She hadn't just bought a crippled cowboy at auction. She had bought the ghost of her own husband's sins. The revelation shattered the fragile peace of Blackwood Creek. For 2 days, Elara was a ghost in her own home, moving through the rooms with a sense of revulsion. The sturdy wooden bed she slept in, the rocker on the porch, the very plates she ate from it all, felt tainted, bought with blood money. Her late husband Richard, whom she had mourned as a kind but ambitious man, was now recast in her mind as a villain, a common thief in a tailored suit. Her grief was complicated by a terrible, gnawing guilt. She looked at Silas and saw not an employee, but a man to whom she owed an unpayable debt. The land, the house, everything she called her own, was morally his. He in turn retreated back into his shell of silence. He had laid his soul bare, and the name he had given her, Thompson, had been a match to a powder keg. He watched her with a wary, pained expression, expecting the inevitable explosion. He expected to be cast out, to be sent away with his sons. His greatest shame now fully exposed. The confrontation came on the 3rd morning. She found him by the creek, watching Leo and Finn skip stones across the shimmering water. The creek was the lifeblood of the ranch, the source of its name and its value. "I am not him," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Silas turned to look at her. "Ma'am, I am not Richard Thompson," she repeated, stepping closer. "I did not know. I swear to you on the life of my unborn child. I had no idea what he did." He searched her eyes, his own filled with a deep, ancient weariness. "I believe you," he said, and the simple words held the weight of a judge's verdict. "What he did, what they did to you, it is a crime that cries out to heaven." She continued, her voice gaining strength. "I cannot give you back the years you've lost, or your health, or your wife. but I will not be a party to this theft. This ranch, it is yours." He shook his head, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips. "It's not that simple. The deed is in your name. The law is on your side, and Jebediah Cain owns the law in this county. If you try to give it to me, he'll find a way to take it from both of us. He will not tolerate seeing a Blackwood back on this land." "Then what are we to do?" she cried, the helplessness of her situation washing over her. "Are we to simply live here under the shadow of his crime?" "For now," Silas said, his gaze turning hard and pragmatic. "We survive. We mend the fences. We strengthen the barn. We prepare for winter. And we watch our backs. Cain is not a man who lets things lie. He let you buy my debt because he thought you were a fool, a weak woman who would fail and be gone by the first snow. He thought he was humiliating me further. But now you're still here," Silas finished, "and I am still here, and that is not part of his plan." Silas's words proved prophetic. The first move from Jebediah Cain came a week later. It wasn't a direct assault with guns and riders. It was something far more insidious, something that attacked the very heart of the ranch. Leo came running from the creek, his face pale with alarm. "Pa, Mrs. Thompson! The water's going down!" Elara and Silas rushed to the creek bed. It was true. The steady, gurgling flow that had been the ranch's constant pulse was now a shallow, muddy trickle. Upstream, just beyond the edge of their property line, they could hear the sounds of hammering and men's rough voices. They walked the half-mile along the dwindling creek, the mud sucking at their boots. What they saw made Elara's heart sink. A dozen of Cain's men were working furiously constructing a crude but effective dam of rock, timber, and earth across Blackwood Creek. They were diverting the water, channeling it into a newly dug ditch that led toward Cain's own vast parched pastures. It was a simple, brutal act of strangulation. Without the creek, the ranch's hayfields would wither, the cattle would thirst, and the land would die. Cain himself was there, sitting astride a magnificent black stallion, overseeing the work like a conquering general. He saw them approach, and a look of triumphant satisfaction spread across his face. "Well, well," he called out, his voice dripping with false geniality. "Mrs. Thompson. Blackwood. Enjoying the morning air. You have no right, Cain." Silas snarled, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The water rights belong to this property. My father filed them with the territory 30 years ago." Cain laughed, a deep, ugly sound. "Your father's filings are dust just like him, as is your claim to this land. According to my deed, and the one in Mrs. Thompson's name, the property line ends 100 yards south of here. This stretch of the creek is on my land, and I'll do with my water as I please." "That's a lie," Silas retorted. "The big sycamore marks the boundary, and you know it." "The sycamore fell in a storm last spring," Cain said smoothly. "Terrible shame. Landmarks change. The survey papers are what matter, and my papers filed and approved by the county clerk say the line is where I stand." It was another swindle, a theft of inches and feet that amounted to a death sentence for the ranch. Elara felt a surge of cold fury. This man's greed was a bottomless pit. "Mr. Cain," she said, her voice ringing with a cold authority that surprised even herself. "You are deliberately starving our livestock and destroying our property. You will cease this construction at once, or I will see you in front of a judge." Cain leaned forward in his saddle, his smile turning into a predatory sneer. "Your threats are as empty as your creek will be by nightfall, ma'am. The nearest federal judge is in San Antonio. That's a long, hard ride for a woman in your delicate condition. And Sheriff Brody here in town, he understands the importance of progress. He understands who pays his salary." He patted his bulging pocket. He looked past her, his gaze landing on Silas with contempt. "You should have stayed gone, Blackwood. You had a chance to disappear. But you came back here, poisoning this woman's mind with your pathetic stories. You see what happens. Everyone tuon, turns to dust." With a final dismissive glare, he spurred his horse and rode off his men, laughing as they threw another heavy log onto the dam. Elara and Silas stood in silence, watching the last of their water being stolen. The rage had drained out of Elara, leaving a cold, hard resolve in its place. The time for defense was over. Cain had declared war. She looked at Silas, his face a grim mask of fury and helplessness. She saw the defeat in his eyes, the old resignation creeping back in. "No," she said, her voice fierce. He looked at her confused. "No," she repeated, her hand going to her belly. "He will not win. He will not turn this place to dust. You know this land, Silas. You know its secrets. There has to be another way. He may own the law, but God owns the mountains. There must be another source of water." Silas stared at her. Then his gaze lifted, moving past the dam, past the mocking figures of Cain's men, and up to the high, rugged mesas that loomed to the west of the valley. A new light flickered in his eyes. It was the faintest glimmer of an idea, a long-forgotten memory, a desperate, impossible chance. "There is one," he whispered, his voice filled with a new, dangerous hope. "But it's not a creek. It's a spring. The old Apache spring. No one's used it in 50 years. They say it's haunted." "I'm not afraid of ghosts, Mr. Blackwood," Elara said, her chin high. "Only of men like Jebediah Cain." The haunted spring was a gamble born of desperation. Silas led the way, his limp a steady rhythmic beat against the hard-packed earth as they climbed into the rocky mesas. He moved with a certainty that belied his injury, his knowledge of the terrain instinctual. He told her stories he'd heard from his father of Apache warriors who used this hidden spring as a secret watering hole, a place of power and ceremony. After a long, arduous climb, he stopped in a small, sheltered basin thick with overgrown brush. "We're here," he announced. With a renewed vigor, he began tearing away at the tangled vines and bushes. Elara helped as much as she could, her hands quickly becoming scratched and raw. After an hour of grueling work, they uncovered it, a small, stone-lined pool choked with mud and leaves, but with a tiny, unmistakable trickle of clear, cold water seeping from a fissure in the rock face. It was a miracle. For the next week, they worked with a feverish intensity. While Silas cleared the spring and dug a narrow channel, Elara made a discovery of her own. Driven by a need to understand the man she had married, she'd been sorting through the trunk of Richard's belongings she had brought from San Antonio. At the very bottom, beneath his fine suits and leather-bound books, was a heavy, locked ledger. Leo, ever curious, found a discarded length of baling wire. With the ingenuity of a child, he bent it and picked the simple lock. The ledger was filled with Richard's neat, precise script, detailing every transaction, every investment. Most of it was meaningless to her, but tucked into a back pocket was a sheaf of letters bound in ribbon. They were from Jebediah Cain. Her hands trembled as she read them. They were a cold, methodical account of the conspiracy to ruin Silas Blackwood. Cain's arrogant, looping script detailed the falsified cattle counts, the plan to entrap Silas in debt, and the strategy for acquiring the water rights. But the most damning letter was the last one. Richard, it read, "The final deed is signed. Blackwood is broken as promised. The bull did its work. He won't be a problem again. Your half of the profits from the Kansas City sale are enclosed. I have purchased the land myself, as we discussed. A fine piece of property. A pity its owner had to be so stubborn. Regards, J. Kane." Tucked inside the folded letter was a bank draft for $10,000. The payment for a man's life. Elara felt sick. Here it was. Proof. Cold, undeniable proof of conspiracy fraud and what was tantamount to attempted murder. This ledger was not just a book of numbers, it was a weapon. That evening, as the first precious trickle of water from the Apache spring reached their wilting garden, she showed the ledger to Silas. He read the letters in silence, his face growing paler with each word. When he looked up, the grief and anger in his eyes were mingled with something new vindication. "He wrote it all down," Silas whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "The fool. He wrote it all down." "He was arrogant," Elara said. "And my husband. He was meticulous. He kept a record of everything. He saw it as a business transaction, nothing more." She looked at Silas, her own guilt a heavy weight. "This is our chance, Silas. Not just to survive, but to fight back. To take back what is yours." "Kane owns Sheriff Brody," Silas reminded her, though his voice lacked its earlier resignation. "Sheriff Brody may be a paid man, but I wager he is also a tired one." Elara countered, her mind racing. "He must be weary of being Kane's dog. A man like that, if given a clear choice between the law and a lawless man with undeniable proof in his hand, he might just choose the law." Their plan was audacious. It relied on a tired lawman's conscience and the power of public opinion. The next day they rode into Redemption Gulch, not as victims, but as accusers. Silas, cleaned and shaven, wore a borrowed shirt and a look of grim determination. Elara, her pregnancy a clear symbol of the future she was fighting for, clutched Richard's ledger to her chest as if it were a holy book. They didn't go to the sheriff's office. They went to the saloon, the heart of Kane's power. It was midday, and the place was crowded with ranch hands and townsfolk. Jebediah Kane was at his usual table in the corner holding court. All conversation stopped as Elara and Silas stepped through the swinging doors. The air grew thick with tension. Kane's eyes narrowed. "Well, look what the buzzards dragged in. Come to beg for your water back." "No, Mr. Kane," Elara said, her voice ringing out in the sudden silence. "We've come to deliver a message. To you and to the sheriff." She looked toward the bar where Sheriff Brody, a man with weary eyes and a drooping mustache, was trying to look invisible. "Sheriff, I believe this falls under your jurisdiction." She walked forward and placed the heavy ledger on the bar with a solid thud. "This is my late husband's business ledger," she announced to the room. In it, and in the accompanying letters, is a full account of the criminal conspiracy to defraud Mr. Silas Blackwood of his land, his cattle, and his livelihood. A conspiracy orchestrated by Mr. Kane. A collective gasp went through the room. Kane's face turned from florid to a sickly purple. Lies. The ramblings of a hysterical woman and a broken-down fool. "Is it a lie, Mr. Kane?" Silas spoke for the first time, his voice low and steady, yet it carried to every corner of the room. Is it a lie that you falsified the cattle manifests? Is it a lie that you had your men stage an accident after I discovered your fraud? It's all in the letters Cain, in your own hand." Sheriff Brody stared at the ledger as if it were a venomous snake. The men in the saloon men who had long suffered under Cain's thumb, who paid his exorbitant prices and feared his temper, were now watching their sheriff. They were waiting to see if he was a lawman or just another one of Cain's employees. Brody picked up the ledger. He opened it. He read one of Cain's letters, his eyes widening. He looked at Cain, then at Silas, then at the expectant faces surrounding him. For a long moment, he was frozen, the weight of the entire town's future on his stooped shoulders. Finally, he closed the ledger. He unpinned the tin star from his vest, polished it on his sleeve, and pinned it back on a little straighter this time. He drew his pistol, its click echoing loudly in the silent room. He didn't point it at Silas. He pointed it squarely at Jebediah Cain. "Jebediah Cain," Sheriff Brody said, his voice no longer weary, but filled with a rediscovered authority. "You are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Get up, slowly." Cain stared at him, utterly stunned. "Brody, have you lost your mind? You're finished." "No, Cain," the sheriff said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "I think I'm just getting started. And you're finished." The room erupted. The spell of fear Cain had cast over Redemption Gulch was broken. For the first time in years, the men in the saloon looked not at Cain, but at the crippled cowboy and the pregnant woman who had done what none of them had dared to do. They had fought back not with bullets, but with truth. And in the Wild West, sometimes the truth was the most powerful weapon of all. The downfall of Jebediah Cain was as swift as it was total. With the ledger as evidence, and Sheriff Brody, a man reborn, leading the charge, Cain's empire of fear crumbled. Men who had been too afraid to speak out before now came forward with their own stories of his swindles and threats. The federal marshal was summoned from San Antonio, and Cain was taken away in chains to face a justice he had long believed he was above. Redemption. Gulch could finally live up to its name. Back at the ranch, the water from the Apache Spring flowed steadily, breathing life back into the thirsty land. The creek, too, was eventually restored, but the spring remained their secret, a symbol of their resilience. The tension between Alara and Silas had vanished, replaced by a deep, unspoken partnership forged in shared adversity and triumph. The question of ownership was no longer a source of conflict. It felt like a moot point. The ranch belonged to both of them and to the children. One cool evening, just as the first stars began to prick the velvet sky, Ilara's labor began. It was fast and fierce. There was no time to fetch a doctor, even if there had been one to trust. There was only Silas, his face etched with a fearful memory of the last time he had been in this situation, and the two wide-eyed boys who seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. Silas, however, was not the same man who had lost his wife. He had been tempered by a new fire. He was calm and capable, his hands gentle, his voice a steady, reassuring murmur. He sent Leo and Finn for boiled water and clean linens, giving them a purpose that kept their fear at bay. He held Ilara's hand, wiping the sweat from her brow, coaching her through the waves of pain with a strength she hadn't known he possessed. In the deep hours of the night, with the lonely cry of a coyote in the distance, Ilara's daughter was born. She was small and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and a cry that was filled with life. Silas wrapped the baby in a clean blanket and placed her in Ilara's arms. Ilara looked from her daughter's tiny face to Silas's, his eyes shining with unshed tears. In that moment, he wasn't just her ranch hand or her partner. He was her family. "What will you name her?" Silas asked, his voice thick with emotion. Ilara looked at her daughter, then at the man who had delivered her, the man whose life was now inextricably bound with hers. "Hope," she whispered. "Her name is Hope." Months passed. The ranch thrived. Under Silas's expert guidance and with Ilara's careful management, the pastures grew green and the cattle grew fat. They hired 2 honest hands from town to help with the workmen who respected both Silas's knowledge and Ilara's resolve. The brand they used was a new one, a simple design combining a T for Thompson and a B for Blackwood intertwined. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of children's laughter, Leo's boisterous shouts, Finn's quiet chuckles, and Hope's happy gurgles. The boys doted on their new sister, a fierce protective instinct blooming in their young hearts. One golden afternoon, Ilara sat on the porch swing nursing Hope. She watched the scene before her. Silas was in the corral with Leo and Finn. He wasn't on a horse, his leg would never allow for that kind of strenuous riding again. But he stood in the center of the ring, his limp barely noticeable, his posture tall and proud. He was teaching his sons the art of the lariat, his scarred hands guiding theirs, his voice patient and clear. He was passing down his legacy not of loss and bitterness, but of skill and pride. He caught her eye and smiled. It was a true smile, one that reached his piercing blue eyes, erasing the last shadows of the broken man she had met at the auction. Ilara smiled back, a deep sense of peace settling over her. She had come to the west seeking an anchor, and had found a storm. She had bought a man's debt, thinking she was performing an act of charity, only to discover she was entangled in his tragedy. But from the ashes of her husband's sins and Silas's ruin, they had built something new. It wasn't a life of San Antonio refinement or a kingdom of cattle. It was something far more precious. It was a home, a partnership, a strange, patched together and beautiful family. It was a future forged not from gold or silver, but from the resilience of the human spirit, and that Ilara knew was a different kind of gold altogether. The story of Ilara, Silas, and their children is a powerful reminder that our darkest moments can often lead to our greatest triumphs. It's a testament to the fact that family isn't always about blood, but about the bonds we forge in the fires of adversity. From the dust of a cruel auction block, they found not just survival, but redemption, proving that even the most broken souls can be mended by courage, truth, and the quiet strength of love. Their journey through the harsh landscapes of the West mirrors the journeys we all take through our own hardships, searching for our own patch of land to call home. If this story of resilience and the creation of an unlikely family moved you, please help us share it with others. Hit that like button to let us know it connected with you, and share this video with someone who appreciates tales of strength and hope. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more dramas from history that explore the depths of the human heart. Your support allows us to keep telling these incredible stories. Thank you for listening.